The October wind that swept through the campus of Blackwood University was not gentle, it was architectural. It carved through the quadrangles of red brick and limestone, stripping the maples of their gold and crimson leaves with a dry, rustling violence. It was a Tuesday afternoon, sharp and bright, the kind of day that demanded clarity. The sunlight hit the slate roofs of the academic buildings, reflecting a blinding white glare that made the shadows seem deeper, darker, and more impenetrable. Viola walked against the wind, clutching a leather satchel to her chest. At 24, Viola was a creature of the margins. She was not a student, with their bright laughter and careless futures. She was not a professor, with their tweed jackets and tenure. She was a transcriptionist. She was the invisible mechanic who took the chaotic, handwritten scrawl of genius and turned it into clean, digital Times New Roman. She lived in a studio apartment 3 miles away, a place that smelled of radiator steam and cheap tea, far removed from the manicured lawns of the elite. She reached the heavy oak doors of the English department. She paused, smoothing down her skirt, checking her reflection in the glass. Her face was pale, her dark hair pulled back in a severe knot that hid the natural curl she fought to control. Her hands were stained with ink, a permanent mark of her trade. She looked ordinary. She looked safe. We build fortresses out of silence, never admitting that the ink we spill is the only place we are truly free. She entered the building. The air inside was still and heavy, smelling of floor wax and old paper. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, her heart beginning a slow, treacherous hammering against her ribs. She wasn't just delivering a file. She was entering the orbit of a star that burned too cold to touch. She stopped in front of the door marked Roman Kincaid, Department Chair / Author in Residence. Roman Kincaid. The name alone carried the weight of a Pulitzer and 3 National Book Awards. At 41, Roman was the literary lion of his generation. He was known for his prose, sparse, devastating, and emotionally guarded. He was a man who wrote about the human condition with surgical precision, but lived his life as if he were immune to it. Viola knocked. It was a soft sound, barely a whisper against the wood. "Enter!" The voice was a low baritone, crisp and devoid of warmth. Viola pushed the door open. The office was a cavern of books. They lined the walls from floor to ceiling, a fortress of knowledge that insulated the man inside from the world. In the center of the room, behind a massive desk of dark walnut, sat Roman. He was writing. He didn't look up. He wore a charcoal sweater over a white collared shirt, his sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms that were surprisingly strong for a man of letters. He wore reading glasses perched on the bridge of a nose that looked like it belonged on a Roman coin. Sharp, aristocratic, and unyielding. "The transcriptions, Professor," Viola said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. Roman finished his sentence. He capped his fountain pen, a deliberate, slow movement, and finally looked up. His eyes were a startling shade of gray, like the Atlantic in winter. They were intelligent, piercing, and completely detached. He looked at Viola not with unkindness, but with the distant politeness one might offer a lamp-post. "Place them on the corner, Miss Davis," Roman said. He used her last name. He always used her last name. It was a wall he erected with every syllable. "I finished the 3rd chapter," Viola said, stepping forward and placing the manila envelope on the polished wood. She hesitated. She knew she should leave. That was the arrangement. He left his handwritten notebooks in a drop box. She returned the typed pages. They were transactions, not conversations. But today was different. The scene in the library, Viola ventured, her fingers lingering on the envelope, where the protagonist describes the woman he watches from afar, the woman who arranges the books by color. Roman stiffened. It was subtle, a slight tightening of his jaw, a freezing of his posture, but to Viola, who had spent months deciphering the loops of his handwriting, it was a scream. "Is there an error in the typing?" Roman asked, his voice cooling by 10 degrees. "No, sir. No error," Viola whispered. "It's just the detail. You wrote that she had ink beneath her fingernails and a scar on her left thumb from a paper cut that never healed properly. She unconsciously covered her left thumb with her other hand. The scar was there. It was small, white and jagged. It was a detail so specific, so microscopic, that no one but a lover or an obsessive observer would notice it." Roman looked at her hands. For a second, the gray ice of his eyes cracked. He looked at the ink stain on her index finger. He looked at the scar. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and suffocating, filled with the dust of 1,000 unsaid words. Then the wall slammed back down. "I am a writer, Miss Davis," Roman said, turning his gaze back to his notebook, dismissing her presence entirely. "It is my job to notice the mundane details of the working class. Do not mistake observation for affection. One is a skill, the other is a weakness." The rejection was elegant, intellectual, and brutal. "Of course," Viola murmured, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. "I apologize for the intrusion." She turned and walked to the door. She felt small. She felt foolish. She had thought, for a wild, delirious moment while typing those pages at 2 a.m., that he had been writing about her. That The Woman in the Shadows was a love letter. But standing here, in the cold light of his office, she realized she was just research. She was just a specimen he had pinned to a board to study. "Viola," Roman said just as her hand touched the doorknob. She stopped. He never used her first name. She didn't turn around. "Yes, sir." "Chapter 4 is in the tray," he said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the floorboards. "It requires sensitive handling. The handwriting is messy. I was distracted when I wrote it." Viola turned then. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring out the window at the dry, swirling leaves, his back rigid, his hand gripping the edge of his desk until the knuckles turned white. "I will be careful with it," she whispered. She took the new notebook from the tray, a black, leather-bound journal that felt warm to the touch, as if he had just been holding it. She walked out of the office, closing the door on the man who spoke to her like she was a stranger, clutching the book that she suspected contained the beating heart he refused to show the world. For the next 3 weeks, Viola lived 2 lives. In the daylight, she was the quiet transcriptionist who navigated the austere hallways of Blackwood University, invisible and efficient. She fetched coffee, she organized files, and she avoided the gaze of the tenure-track professors who looked through her as if she were made of glass. But at night, in the solitude of her small apartment, she lived inside Roman Kincaid's mind. The black leather notebook, Chapter 4, sat on her desk like a loaded weapon. The handwriting was different this time. It was jagged, rushed, the ink pressed hard into the paper as if the thoughts had been fighting to escape. As Viola typed, her fingers trembling over the keys, she felt a heat rising in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the radiator rattling in the corner. Roman wasn't writing a novel. He was writing a confession disguised as fiction. The protagonist was a man of iron and intellect, trapped in a tower of his own making. And the woman was a shadow with a voice like rain. He described her sitting in a diner on 4th Street, the exact diner where Viola ate lunch every Tuesday. He described the way she folded her napkin into a crane when she was nervous, a habit Viola had possessed since childhood. We hide our hearts in the pages of books, hoping that the one person who knows how to read us will finally find the bookmark. He wrote about the way the light caught the stray curl of hair behind her ear. He wrote about the ink stain on her finger as if it were a royal seal. But when she saw him in the corridors, Roman Kincaid was a glacier. He would nod, once, sharply, and continue walking, his eyes fixed on some distant intellectual horizon. The dissonance was driving her mad. It came to a head on the night of the departmental gala. It was an obligatory event for the staff, held in the cavernous faculty lounge, a room of dark wood paneling and portraits of dead men who judged the living. Viola was there not to celebrate, but to assist. She stood by the entrance, checking coats and handing out programs, dressed in a simple navy dress that blended into the curtains. Roman arrived late. He swept into the room, wearing a tuxedo that fit him with lethal precision. The air in the room seemed to shift, gravitating toward him. He was immediately surrounded by the elite, the dean, the donors, and Eleanor Vance, a visiting professor of comparative literature who was as sharp and glittering as a diamond. Eleanor placed a hand on Roman's arm, whispering something that made him offer a rare, tight smile. Viola watched from the coat check. She felt a sharp, physical pain in her chest, a mixture of jealousy and humiliation. In the notebook, he had written that he loathed the perfumed suffocation of society. Yet here he was, breathing it in, looking like a king among his court. She turned away, focusing on arranging the hangers. She needed to remember her place. She was the transcriptionist. He was the author. The words in the notebook were just prose. They were lies made of ink. "Miss Davis!" The voice was right behind her. Viola spun around. Roman had left the circle of admirers. He had left Eleanor. He was standing at the coat check counter, the barrier of the wooden desk between them. His gray eyes were dark, scanning her face with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Professor Kincaid," she stammered, "do you need your coat? Are you leaving?" "I am trapped," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. He didn't look like a man who was trapped. He looked like a man who was hunting. "I need you to retrieve a file from my office. I left the draft of the keynote speech on my desk. The dean insists I deliver it." "Now?" Viola asked, looking at the party in full swing. "Now," Roman commanded, but then his hand moved. He reached across the counter, ostensibly to adjust a stack of programs, but his fingers grazed her wrist. The touch was electric, scorching. It lasted for a fraction of a second, but it carried the weight of the entire notebook. And Viola! It was the first time he had used her name in public. "Be careful," he said, his eyes dropping to her mouth, then snapping back to her eyes. The door locks automatically. Viola fled. She ran across the quad, the cold night air biting at her bare arms, but she felt feverish. She unlocked his office, the sanctuary of books. She found the speech on the desk. But next to it, open and waiting, was the notebook for Chapter 5. She shouldn't look. She knew she shouldn't. She looked. The page was covered in a scrawl so chaotic it was almost illegible. But one phrase stood out, underlined 3 times. "I see her standing in the doorway of the gala, invisible to them, and I want to burn the entire room down just so the light will finally hit her face." Viola gasped. The room spun. "Did you find it?" She whipped around. Roman was standing in the doorway of the office. He had followed her. He had left his own gala, left the dean, left the expectations of a station to chase the transcriptionist into the dark. He stepped inside and closed the door. The sound of the latch clicking shut was deafening. "You wrote this," Viola whispered, her hand hovering over the notebook. "About tonight. You wrote it before it happened." "I write what I cannot say," Roman replied, stepping closer. The air in the room grew thin. He wasn't the professor now. He was the man from the pages. "If I spoke to you the way I write about you, Miss Davis, I would lose my tenure. I would lose my reputation. I would be a fool." "And what are you now?" she challenged, emboldened by the ink. "A coward," Roman admitted, stopping inches from her. He looked down at her, his aristocratic face twisted in a conflict of duty and desire. "A coward who is starving." He reached out. He took the speech from her hand, but he didn't pull away. He stood there, inhaling the scent of her, the cheap soap, the rain, the reality of her, while the party went on without him. "Go back to the gala, Roman," Viola said, her voice shaking. "They are waiting for the genius." "Let them wait," he whispered. I am currently editing. He didn't kiss her. He didn't cross the final line. But the space between them vibrated with a tension so thick it felt like gravity. He was a man of words, and she was the only one who knew how to read the silence he was leaving between them. He turned and walked out, leaving her alone in the dark office with the terrifying realization that the tragedy he was writing wasn't fiction, it was us. The morning after the gala, the campus of Blackwood University seemed to be holding its breath. The sky was a bruised shade of purple-gray, low and heavy with impending snow that refused to fall. Viola moved through the corridors like a ghost haunting the scene of her own death. The memory of Roman standing in the dark office, the scent of him, the admission of his cowardice, was a fever that burned beneath her skin. She wasn't just the transcriptionist anymore. She was the story. And for the first time in her life, she allowed herself the dangerous luxury of believing she might also be the ending. She carried the final transcribed pages of Chapter 5 in her satchel. She hadn't slept. She had spent the night staring at the screen, watching his words dissect her soul, realizing that he saw everything. The way she held her teacup, the hesitation in her step, the lonely geometry of her life. She reached the Department of English. The hallway was empty, the silence amplified by the ticking of the grandfather clock near the dean's office. She approached Roman's door. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness cutting through the wood. Viola raised her hand to knock, but a voice stopped her. It wasn't Roman's. It was sharp, crystalline, and laced with a terrifying intelligence. "It's reckless, Roman. Even for you." It was Eleanor Vance. Viola froze. Her hand hovered in the air. She knew she should leave. She knew that listening was a violation. But her feet were nailed to the floorboards. "It is a draft, Eleanor," Roman's voice replied. It sounded weary, cornered. "It is not for public consumption." "It's not just a draft," Eleanor countered. There was the sound of pages turning, the heavy, distinct sound of the black leather notebook. "I found this on your desk when I came to return your speech. I read it, Roman. All of it. The shadow with a voice like rain. The scar on the thumb. The ink stains." Viola stopped breathing. "It's obviously the transcriptionist," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more judgment than a shout. "The quiet little thing with the messy hair. You are writing a love letter to the help, Roman. If the tenure board sees this, if the dean reads this, they won't see literature. They will see a predator exploiting a subordinate." A long, agonizing silence filled the room. Viola pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird trying to break a cage. She waited. She waited for Roman to defend the art. She waited for him to defend her. "She is not a subordinate," Roman said finally. "She is." "She is what?" Eleanor challenged. "Your muse. Your lover." "She is a study," Roman said. The words were cold, absolute. They drifted through the crack in the door and pierced Viola straight through the center of her hope. "A study," Eleanor repeated, skeptical. "Yes," Roman continued, his voice gaining a desperate, icy strength. He was building the wall back up, brick by terrified brick. "She is a blank slate, Eleanor. She has no life of her own. She exists in the margins. It makes her the perfect vessel for the character. I am not writing about her. I am writing about the archetype of invisibility. She is simply convenient research. We endure the silence of the world, but it is the words of the people we love that finally make us deaf." Viola felt the floor dissolve beneath her. Convenient research. A blank slate. No life of her own. He hadn't just denied his feelings. He had stripped her of her humanity. He had taken the intimacy of his observation, the way he noticed her scar, her habits, her essence, and reduced it to a cold, academic exercise. He had turned her into a specimen. She pushed the door open. She didn't mean to. It was a reflex, a need to make the pain physical. Roman and Eleanor turned. Roman was standing behind his desk, looking pale and exhausted. Eleanor was sitting on the edge of the desk, holding the black notebook. When Roman saw Viola, the color drained from his face. His gray eyes widened, shattering the mask of indifference he had just constructed. He looked at her and he knew. He knew she had heard. "Miss Davis," Eleanor said, smoothing her skirt, recovering her composure instantly. "We were just discussing the creative process." Viola didn't look at Eleanor. She looked at Roman. She looked at the man who had stood in the dark with her hours ago and told her he was starving. Now he looked full of fear, full of pride, full of the lie that kept him safe in his tower. "I brought the files, Professor," Viola said. Her voice didn't shake. It was dead. She walked forward. She didn't place the envelope on the corner of the desk. She let it drop from her hand. It hit the floor with a flat, final slap. "Viola!" Roman started, stepping around the desk. He reached out a hand, a reflexive gesture of apology, of panic. "It's Miss Davis," Viola corrected him, stepping back. Her eyes were dry, burning with a dignity she didn't know she possessed. "I wouldn't want you to confuse the research with the person." "You don't understand," Roman whispered, the desperation leaking into his tone. "I had to. I understand perfectly," Viola interrupted. She looked at the black notebook in Eleanor's hand. The book that contained her soul, now tainted, twisted into something small and cheap. "I am just a blank slate, Roman. I have no life. I'm just ink for your pen." She looked at him one last time. She saw the regret warring with the cowardice in his eyes. She saw the man who wanted to love her drowning inside the man who needed to be admired. "I resign," she said softly. "You'll have to find another vessel." She turned and walked out. "Viola!" Roman shouted. It was a raw sound, unrefined, stripping his throat. She didn't stop. She walked down the hallway, past the portraits of the dead men, past the classrooms where they taught the theory of tragedy without understanding the weight of it. She walked out of the building and into the gray, snow-heavy air. The wind bit at her face, but she didn't feel it. She felt lighter. She felt the terrible, hollow likeness of someone who has been erased. She had spent months translating his messy scrawl into clarity, but now, finally, the meaning was unmistakable. He had written a masterpiece about loving her, but he didn't have the courage to read it out loud. The separation was absolute, leaving nothing behind but a black notebook full of lies and the echo of a door closing forever. 7 days. That was how long the silence had reigned in the Department of English. It wasn't the studious, reverent silence of a library. It was the hollow, echoing silence of a tomb. The snow that had threatened the sky on the day Viola left had finally fallen, burying the campus in a suffocating layer of white. It muffled the footsteps of the students and erased the sharp edges of the architecture, turning the world soft and featureless. Roman Kincaid sat at his walnut desk. He hadn't written a word in a week. The fountain pen lay capped on the blotter. The leather notebook for Chapter 6 remained closed. Without Viola to receive the pages, the words refused to come. He realized with a terrifying clarity that he hadn't just been writing a novel, he had been engaging in a correspondence. Every sentence had been a signal sent into the dark, waiting for her to catch it. Without her, he was just shouting into a void. He looked at the empty tray where she used to leave the manila envelopes. He looked at the chair she had stood next to. The ghost of her presence was louder than any lecture he had ever given. We build cages out of our pride, locking the door from the inside, and then wonder why we are so cold. He couldn't stay in the tower. Roman stood up. He didn't grab his coat or his briefcase. He grabbed the black notebook, the one Eleanor had held, the one that contained the research. He walked out of his office, ignoring the startled look of the department secretary. He walked out of the building, into the biting cold, and for the first time in 20 years, Roman Kincaid walked away from the university. He drove to the address on her personnel file. It was a part of the city he never visited, A neighborhood of narrow row houses and faded siding, where the snow wasn't pristine white but gray with exhaust and grit. He parked his luxury sedan awkwardly against a snowbank. He climbed the steps to 3B. His hand, usually steady enough to sign autographs for hours, was trembling. He knocked. There was a long pause. He heard footsteps. The peephole darkened. The door opened, but the chain remained fastened, allowing only a sliver of warm light and a slice of her face to appear. Viola looked tired. Her hair was loose, wilder than he had ever seen it, framing a face that was stripped of the professional deference she had always worn like armor. "Professor," she said. The word was flat. "If you are looking for the final transcriptions, I left them with the dean's secretary the day I left. You have everything." "I am not here for the files," Roman said, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "I am here to apologize, and to beg." Viola didn't unlatch the chain. "You called me a blank slate, Roman. You called me convenient. There is nothing left to say." "I lied," Roman said. The confession was sharp, cutting through the cold. "I lied to Eleanor. I lied to myself. And I need you to open this door so I can tell you the truth." Viola hesitated. She looked at his eyes, the gray Atlantic eyes that were usually so guarded. Now, they were wide, raw, and desperate. She saw the snow on his shoulders. She saw the book in his hand. Slowly, against her better judgment, she slid the chain lock free. She opened the door. Roman stepped into her apartment. It was small, smelling of cinnamon tea and old books, a scent that hit him like a physical memory. It was humble, cluttered, and infinitely warmer than his office. "Why?" Viola asked, crossing her arms, creating a barrier between them. "Why did you say those things?" "Because I was terrified," Roman admitted. He didn't pace. He stood still, trapped in the gaze of the woman he had underestimated. Eleanor found the book. She knew. If she had gone to the dean, if she had accused me of pursuing you, they would have destroyed you, Viola. They would have painted you as a seductress climbing the ladder, or a victim being exploited. I panicked. I thought if I diminished you, if I made you sound like an object, she would lose interest. I thought I was protecting you." "You didn't protect me," Viola whispered, her voice shaking with the echo of the hurt. "You erased me. You looked at the woman who knows your mind better than anyone, and you called her nothing." "I know," Roman said, his voice breaking. "And it is the greatest regret of my life. Because the truth is, you are not the research, Viola. You are the story. You have always been the story." He held out the black notebook. "Take it," he said. Viola looked at the leather cover. "I don't work for you any more, Roman. I don't want you to transcribe it," Roman said softly. "I want you to keep it. It's the only copy. If you want to burn it, burn it. If you want to read it. But I cannot write another word until you know what is actually on those pages." Viola reached out. Her fingers brushed his, a shock of cold against warmth, and she took the book. She opened it to the page where the bookmark ribbon lay. It wasn't the scene about the gala. It was a new entry, written in ink that looked fresh. She looked down and read the scrawled handwriting. "She stands in the snow, and I realize that all my awards, all my tenure, all my acclaim are just dust. I would trade every word I have ever written just to hold her hand without gloves." She looked up at him. The tears were finally spilling over, hot and fast. "You wrote this," she whispered. "I lived it," Roman corrected. "I have spent my life observing the world from a distance, Viola. Safe behind my desk. Safe behind my words. But you broke the glass. You saw the ink on my fingers, and you didn't look away." He took a step closer. The distance between the professor and the transcriptionist, between the hill and the city, collapsed into the few inches of cheap rug between their feet. "I don't want to be the author anymore," Roman whispered, stripping away the last of his titles. "I just want to be the man who is allowed to love you." Viola looked at the book in her hands, the proof of his heart. She looked at the man standing in her living room, stripped of his arrogance, shivering slightly from the cold he had braved to find her. The pain was still there, a bruise on her pride, but beneath it, the hope was beginning to unfurl like a leaf in spring. "If you stay," Viola said, her voice trembling but clear, "you can't speak to me like a stranger. Not ever again." "Never," Roman vowed. "I am done with fiction." He didn't move to touch her yet. He waited. He let her hold the power. He let her decide if the man who wrote about love was worthy of experiencing it. The tension in the room was electric, a wire pulled taut between forgiveness and fear, vibrating with the promise that the next chapter wouldn't be written in solitude. Viola did not close the notebook. She held it open against her chest, pressing the chaotic, desperate handwriting over her heart like a shield that had finally become a badge of honor. The snow outside the window fell in thick, silent sheets, burying the city, burying the university, burying the distance that had separated them for so long. "You said you were done with fiction," Viola whispered, stepping closer to him. The scent of him, cold air, old paper, and the sharp tang of anxiety filled her small living room. "So tell me something true, Roman. Tell me something you didn't write down first." Roman looked at her. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed a stray curl of hair from her forehead. It was the same gesture he had written about in Chapter 3, but here, in the dim light of her apartment, without the safety of a metaphor, it felt terrifyingly real. "The truth is," Roman said, his voice rough with emotion, "I hate the quiet. I spent 20 years convincing the world that I needed silence to create, that I needed solitude to be a genius. But the truth is, I was just lonely. And when you walked into my office, when I saw the ink on your fingers, the silence became unbearable. Because I realized I didn't want to write about the world anymore. I wanted to share it with you." He leaned down. The hesitation that had defined their relationship, the pauses, the glances, the walls evaporated. He kissed her. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It wasn't polite. It was a reclamation. It tasted of the cold winter air and the burning heat of a confession too long delayed. It was the collision of the author and the muse, the professor and the transcriptionist, finally meeting on the only ground that mattered, the truth. In that kiss, Roman Kincaid destroyed the fortress he had built. He let the snow fall on his library. He let the wind blow through his tenure. He surrendered the safety of being an observer for the dangerous, messy, exquisite reality of being a participant. 3 months later, the spring thaw had turned the Blackwood campus into a riot of green. The red brick buildings stood unchanged, stoic and imposing, but the name on the door of the department chair had changed. Roman had stepped down. He surrendered his tenure to write truth instead of teaching theory. It was a quiet scandal, whispered about over sherry in the faculty lounge, but to Roman it wasn't a loss. It was a liberation. He sat now in a sun-drenched corner of a coffee shop on 4th Street, the very diner he had once used as a setting for his loneliness. But he wasn't alone. Viola sat across from him. She wasn't transcribing. She was reading. She held the first printed copy of his new novel, the one that had replaced the convenient research. The cover was simple, elegant. She turned to the dedication page. There were no cryptic initials, no hidden codes. It read, in stark black type, "To Viola, the only story I never want to end." "It's beautiful, Roman," she said, looking up over the rim of the book. Her eyes were bright, no longer the eyes of a woman living in the margins. "It's honest," Roman corrected, reaching across the table to take her hand. He didn't care who saw. He didn't care if former students walked by or if Eleanor Vance was watching from a window. He rubbed his thumb over the small white scar on her hand, the flaw he had once catalogued as data, now the landmark he loved most in the world. "Do you miss it?" Viola asked, squeezing his fingers. "The tower? The reverence?" Roman looked out the window at the busy street, at the life moving past them in a chaotic, unedited stream. "I miss the library sometimes," he admitted with a faint smile. "But I realize something, Viola. A book is a closed system. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's safe because you can control it. But this," he gestured to her, to the coffee cups, to the sunlight hitting the table. This is infinite, and I would rather live one messy, unwritten day with you than write 1,000 perfect pages alone. We build fortresses out of silence, never admitting that the ink we spill is the only place we are truly free, until we find the person who gives us the courage to put down the pen and open the door. The leitmotif returned to them, no longer a tragedy, but a lesson learned. They had spent so much time hiding behind words, using language as a barrier, that they had almost missed the language of touch, of presence, of love. They finished their coffee and walked out into the spring afternoon. Roman didn't walk ahead of her. He walked beside her, his hand firmly in hers. They walked past a bookstore where his previous novels were displayed in the window, monuments to a man who no longer existed. Roman Kincaid had spent a lifetime speaking to Viola like a stranger, protecting his heart with layers of indifference and prose. But as they turned the corner, disappearing into the crowd of the city, he knew the transformation was complete. He wasn't the protagonist of a lonely tragedy anymore. He was just a man in love, finally living a story that was too beautiful to ever be written down. He had written 1,000 worlds where he was the hero, never suspecting that his greatest masterpiece would be the quiet, ordinary life he built with the woman he had once tried to edit out of his heart.